Hey guys, it's Austin here with Out Jeeping, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you guys how to install a standard U-joint on a drive shaft. Now right here we're going to be installing it on my 2001 Jeep Cherokee, and recently on the rear drive shaft, one of the U-joints that goes down to the axle is actually going bad and it has a really bad vibration under acceleration, so that tells me the U-joint is bad, and I also went underneath it and moved around the drive shaft and there's a lot of slop. So today I'm going to be showing you guys how to remove your drive shaft and take out the old U-joint and put the new one and put the drive shaft back in. So let's get started. Alright, so I'm going to start off with chalking out the front tires. Since it is a rear drive shaft, we're going to have to be lifting up the rear axle to rotate it. That way we can get all the bolts at a proper angle. That way we won't be able to strip it out. So I'm going to chalk the front and back of the front tires. Alright, so now I'm going to put the jack under the rear axle and just get it ready for when I need to jack it up to be able to turn the drive shaft. Now this works with an open differential. You can just jack up the axle on one side and rotate one tire. Now if you have an LSD, a welded differential or spooled, or if your axle is just locked all the time, you're going to want to lift up your entire axle. That way you can move both tires on the same axle. But since this is just an open differential on the rear, I'm going to do one side. Alright, so we're under the Jeep here, and as you can see, this is our rear drive shaft going to our rear axle. And I have the transmission in neutral right now with the tires blocked off so that way it can't move. And I'll just give it a little play, and as you can see, that U-joint has a lot of slop in it, and it shouldn't be moving like that, and this is a key cause to a lot of vibrations as you're going down the road. So what we're going to be doing is replacing the drive shaft. I do have a slip yoke eliminator kit, so it has the drive shaft with the double cardan joint up here by the transfer case and just the normal U-joint styled back down here, and we have 4 8mm bolts that hold it on this side and 4 others that go back into the transfer case. Now this isn't an aftermarket drive shaft. If your Cherokee guys are wondering, this is just a normal front stock drive shaft for an XJ that I fitted it on the rear. It fits perfect actually. Probably later on down the road it might get a little bit beefier drive shaft like an Atom shaft or something, but for now this works fine. So I'm just going to take an 8mm and loosen these up. I prefer 6-point socket when doing this because these guys strip out pretty easily. So if you are doing this, make sure you have a 6-sided socket, and then it'll save a headache of having to deal with a strip bolt. Alright, so once you have both those bolts out, your U-joint strap is going to come out. I'm going to set that somewhere where you don't lose it. And now this is the point where we jack up the rear axle on one side. That way we can spin the drive shaft without the vehicle moving. That way we can get out the other 2 bolts with it being easy, because all we'll have to do is just go in here and we won't have to be dealing with the yoke in the way and going on some weird funky angle. Alright, so with that wheel off the ground, we can take our rear shaft and rotate it 180 degrees. And as you can see, one of the wheels spins. And now I'm going to set the jack back down. That way I'll lock it. That way we can get the bolts off without it spinning the drive shaft. Now we can repeat the process and take off this side. Now I'm taking out this last bolt. Make sure you have your hand up here by the drive shaft just in case it does fall down. Sometimes they do if they're loose in here, but most of the time they do like to stay stuck in the yoke. Alright, so this one is still stuck in there. Sometimes you can just pull it away. Nope, and that worked. Other times you have to pry it, but that one came out nicely. As you can see right here, this was our problem. The bearings are pretty much gone because the grease dried up in there. It was just metal on metal, and all the bearings are dust now. And lastly, we got to take off this side that goes into the transfer case. If you have a factory drive shaft for a Jeep Cherokee, you're just going to have a slip yoke right here, and all you have to do is literally just pull it out of the transfer case. But right here, since we have the yokes bolted together to the transfer case, we have some more 8mm bolts. It's going to be pretty much the same thing as it was on the last side. The way I have this locked in place, I just put the transmission in park, and as you can see, it's locked right there. And when I need to rotate it 180 degrees to do the other side, I just put in neutral and then park again, and then it's locked. So I'm going to take these guys out. Okay, so now I'll go and put it in neutral and rotate it. Alright, so now it's locked back into park, and now we can proceed to take it off. Now when you're taking out the last two that hold up the drive shaft, once again have your hand on it so that way it just doesn't fall off. Alright, so with all those bolts out, we should be able to pop it down just like that, and now we can remove this out of the Jeep. Alright, so I got these two drive shafts sitting right here. This is what I'm running in the rear of my Jeep right now, and it's the same thing that you're going to have for your front drive shaft. And this is actually a factory rear shaft that's probably in majority of vehicles that use the slip yoke style. And all you have to do to remove it on the transfer case side, like I said before, is just slip it out, because all it is just splined into the transfer case. But as far as it goes for the rear U-joint, it's pretty much the same procedure. They both strap to that yoke that's on the axle, and we only have to pound it in on this one yoke that goes in the main shaft right here. So I'm going to be replacing this U-joint with a Spicer one, which is the OEM brand. I recommend using Spicer whenever you can. I've had bad luck with cheaper U-joints, such as even Moog ones. I rebuilt an entire front drive shaft before using all Moog stuff, and 1 year later one of the U-joints basically didn't have any more grease in it, and it was just metal on metal. So I've also had instances of using Moog brands for axle U-joints and them being too small, and they actually just slide in too good, and after 3 months it actually failed. So whenever you can, use Spicer. They're an OEM brand for a lot of vehicles out there, especially trucks and Jeeps. And also along in our kit, we do have a variety of sizes of clips. Now they do have instructions on here saying that these clips are different thicknesses, so you're going to want to match up your old clip to the one that they have in the bag. They got 3 different sizes in here, and we're only going to be using 2 of them out of the 12 that come with it. So I'm going to be working on getting these clips out. Obviously we only have 2 for this style U-joint that goes up to the axle yoke. Now if you got a U-joint on the double cardan side, you're going to want to remove all 4 of them obviously, and then there's only 2 that go here connecting to the transfer case. So I'm going to be taking the needle in those pliers and seeing if this breaks free. You want to make sure you wear safety glasses for this, because sometimes these go flying and you don't want it in your eye. Alright, so it seems like one side broke free, but the other side isn't, and we need it broken free all the way around. So I'm just going to take either a chisel or a crappy screwdriver, hammer on the other side, and that way it should be able to free it up. Alright, so that started rotating in its socket, so I'm just going to take it and try to remove it. Alright, that one came out pretty easy. Sometimes they actually do break off and they'll come out in chunks. But we'll work on the other side, get this side off as well. Alright, those came out pretty easily. Alright, so the way that we're going to pound out this old U-joint is I'm just basically going to be using some old sockets and some hammers to pound it out. I prefer this method over any other method because it gives a nice shock to it and helps break that bond. That way nothing is really binding. I have done axle shaft U-joints in the past, and I use a hydraulic press, and what happens if they're really rusted in there is that sometimes you actually bend the ears, and then you'll find out when putting new U-joints in that stuff won't be aligned properly. So doing the hammer method, I prefer that best. And there's other ways. You can sometimes use a vise, but I don't recommend that because I've actually broken one of my vices a few years ago trying to pop this out. So to pound this out, we're going to want to use a smaller socket that's going to fit in the inside, that's going to hammer down on the cap, and then we'll use a bigger one that goes on the bottom, and we'll put that right in there. That way when we hammer this down, it should pound out the other side through here into this bigger socket. You just basically want it big enough so that way it covers the whole ear on the yoke. But first, before I start hammering this away, I'm just going to put a little bit of penetrating lubricant in here. So I got some PB Blaster. Hopefully this should help break the seal a little bit, and hopefully it should come out nicely. So you can do this on the workbench. You can have someone else hold the end of the shaft while you hammer down on it, or you can just do it on the floor like I am, and you should be able to do it with one person. So I'm going to set this up, and then I'm going to give it a few whacks and see if this starts moving. And as you can see, that actually worked out perfect. Pound it all the way down. Remove our socket, and then if this is still a little bit stuck in there, I'm going to get a pair of channel locks and we should be able to remove it. Alright, that's the herb cap, and sometimes you'll be able to remove it just popping it through here. Other times you might have to go and actually pound it the opposite way and remove that last one, but this one actually came out nicely and just popped it in one way. So now before we put in our new U-joint, I'm going to go and clean all this stuff up. If you accidentally hammered on any of the ears, you're going to want to make sure you file it out so that there's no burrs on there, and make sure that that little ring that our clip is going to sit in is nice and clean. You can also go in here with this thin Scotch-Brite if you have some rust in there, just to remove any stuff that's going to be in the way while installing our new U-joint. Alright, so I got the yoke all cleaned up, and now I'm going to go and reinstall our U-joint here. This one is a non-greasable one, so we don't have to worry about adding any grease in when it's all done. Or sometimes they might have a grease zerk on the side they can pump full of grease, but this one already comes pre-greased, so we don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to take off two caps on the opposite ends of each other, and we want to be very careful that we don't mix them up, and we want to be very careful that we don't pop out any needle bearings or mess with the seal at all. So now I'm going to fit this in the side here. Putting one end there, one end the other, and now very carefully I'm going to feed in a cap on one side, line it up with the U-joint. Now I'm going to push it all the way in so that way all the needle bearings are around that shaft. And then I'm just going to take a little hammer and start to pound this in place. This doesn't take much force at all. And before I have that all the way seated, I'm going to do the opposite end so that way it lines up nicely. Alright, so now is the critical part when we start hammering in the second side. We want to make sure that the U-joint is halfway in between the caps, so that way when we start hammering, the needle bearings still have pressure up against the U-joint and that they don't fall out of place. I've actually had it one time where I was trying to pound it in and I couldn't get it all the way. It turns out that one of the needle bearings actually fell off and was in the bottom of the cap and was preventing me from hammering it all the way in. So I'm just going to give it a little tap. Alright, so now that we have it flush here, I'm going to take our socket that we use for pounding and just put it on top of that cap and hammer it down far enough so that way we can get our C-clip in. Alright, so once you matched up your clips to the old ones you have as in thickness, you can go and install it on one of the sides. Once again, you want to wear safety glasses and use your needle nose pliers, crimp it down, and if you can't go down any further, just kind of push it, and then it pops into place just like that. Now we'll rotate it 180 degrees and do the other side. And if it doesn't go all the way in, you can take your socket and go over the clip. You can give it a couple whacks and see if it pops into place. Alright, so that one went in. Now as you can see, after we have our clips all in, our U-joint is actually pretty tight and is not as loose as it should be. And a little trick you can do is actually hammer on the side of the yoke, and that'll shock it, and that way the ears will kind of separate just a little bit and press out against the clips on each side. That way it should be a nice and easy rotation compared to this tightness right here. Alright, so that's a lot smoother right there. Now we're ready to go install this back into the Jeep. Alright, so I'm ready to reinstall the shaft, and before I put these bolts back in, I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on there because it's better safe than sorry. You don't want this coming off, otherwise you're going to be tearing some ears on some drive shafts. So now I'm just going to line this up to the yoke here on the transfer case and start threading in some bolts. And I'm just going to thread the top ones in place so that way everything is lined up, and then I'll tighten down the bottom ones. So when tightening these bolts down, it's nothing crazy tight because obviously these are little bolts. You just want a nice firm snugness. Alright, so with this all hooked up by the transfer case, I'm going to go and put it in neutral, and then we'll hook it up by the axle. Alright, so I went and cleaned up the yoke because I had a bunch of grease and sand and crap that was in here. And now we can put our drive shaft in, now that everything is all nice and clean. And then when we pop this in, we want to make sure that we have the U-joint cap right behind these little tabs on either side. So you might have to push it in, maybe tap it a little bit with a hammer just to get that to pop into place. But I got mine all set in there, and I'm going to put the U-joint straps back on here along with the bolts and tighten everything down a little bit evenly. Then I'll set the tire back on the ground so that way this won't roll when I try and torque them down. Now once again, I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on these bolts. Alright, so I got the straps and bolts all hand threaded back into place, and I got the rear tires on the ground, so now everything is locked up here, and I have the transmission in park now, so we don't need the blocks anymore. But I'm going to go and torque these all down, and now on my drive shaft, if I have the bolts on either side, I actually have enough clearance to get my ratchet in here. On some drive shafts you might have to do the same technique as what we did for taking them off, but for me, this all works out nicely. So now when tightening these up, you want to go back and forth on the U-joint strap and then back and forth across each side. That way this just tightens up evenly, and that way it should go on square without any problems. Alright, so before we call it good, now is a good time to grease up any grease zerks you have, either underneath your vehicle entirely or just on the drive shaft that we're working on. Mine specifically only has one on the slip joint, so I'm just going to add some grease until it starts either coming out the seal or the weep hole that's in the back here by the yoke. If you do have greasable U-joints, you probably want to pump those up a couple pumps with some more grease in there until you see some grease coming out of the seals that are by the U-joint caps. Alright, so I started to feel some grease in the back of here, so it's all full inside this cavity. Now we're all good. Alright guys, that's going to be a wrap for today's video. As you saw, it's a nice, quick, easy replacement to do. If you guys are wondering how to do axle U-joints, I got a video on that already, and I'll post it in the description below. But as far as U-joints, this is pretty standard across all vehicles, so this should help you majority of the time, or if you have a Jeep Cherokee, this would pretty much be identical for you. This was just a standard 1310 U-joint, which is in a lot of vehicles, a lot of Jeeps, and some light trucks as well. But even bigger U-joints, they're all pretty much the same style in how they install. So I hope you guys learned something. Make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. It helps keep these videos coming. If you guys have any more questions or comments, make sure to post them below, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next how-to.